that was amazing. Incredible tour de force, and really, as I said, nobody thinking about how to protect our country and keep it safe over the last 30 years, and Tony Fauci. So amazing way to begin. What we're going to do next is I'm going to bring the first panel up, and we have a little video. So let me line up the video while I ask our first panelists to come up. So if we could have Mike, Dennis, Hillary, and Masoka come on up and join us. And the first video, so we had asked Larry Summers to come and offer some remarks. Larry is traveling. For those of you who don't know, he's the Eliot University professor, former president of Harvard, former Treasury Secretary. So then the question is, why Larry Summers? He has been very deeply engaged in this and thinking about this and cares a lot about this. I was going to say, I realize you guys may not be able to see the video from sitting up there, so it's up to you if you want to, either way. And so Larry was kind enough to record a video for us. And it's about 6 minutes. We're going to watch it. And then I will introduce our panelists and we'll get started on our first panel.
I welcome the Harvard Global Health Initiative's review of what happened a century ago with the flu pandemic and its effort to look forward to mitigating the risks and the consequences of future pandemics. I am convinced that pandemic flu is the least focused on of major global challenges. Vast efforts and concern surround nuclear proliferation. Vast efforts appropriately are directed to issues around global climate change. Taking the risks over time of pandemic, I believe that the consequences are similar in terms of total economic impact, in terms of lives lost, to the risks associated with climate change and the risks associated with nuclear proliferation. And yet, pandemic risk is an obsession for specialists, a preoccupation of those concerned with insurance and reinsurance, but a much less mainstream issue than nuclear proliferation or global climate change. And so I believe that this initiative that reminds us that more people died in the flu epidemic after World War I than died as a consequence of World War I, that reminds us of how profoundly society was changed by a disease that took the strongest rather than the weakest among us, those who were young or of middle age, is something that is very, very important. We certainly have made immense progress in the biomedical sciences over the last century, and that is a positive development with respect to pandemic risks. On the other hand, we live in a much, much smaller and much, much more interconnected world, which means that disease vectors will be transmitted that much more rapidly. Full quarantines will be that much more difficult. We live in a world that faces too much superstition, propaganda, dare I say it, fake news, and confusion with respect to vaccination, which has to be at the center of any effort to control epidemics and pandemics. And we live in a world where too often the preoccupation is with the urgent rather than with the profoundly important. And that diverts us too from preparing for the next pandemic. I believe that this is a central challenge that deserves far more global attention than it is now receiving. And I'm glad to see Harvard's Global Health Initiative do its part to arouse concern, prompt study and reflection, and drive preparation for the epidemics and pandemics that are all too likely to come, albeit unpredictably, at some point in the future.
Great. So, as I said, most people in this room have been thinking about and working on these issues. But Larry Summers, who has thought broadly, has worked obviously across a variety of sectors and is one of the leading economists and I think public intellectuals, has glommed onto something that is really a key issue, which is that this is not a specialized issue. This is not a healthcare issue. This is not an issue that specialists need to obsess on. And the point he makes that if you think about the things that can cause catastrophic harm to human society, right? Global climate change is more slow-moving, but if you think about things like a nuclear weapon going off in a major city, terrorist threats, we spend enormous amount of resources, and rightly so, on understanding those risks and mitigating those risks. And then when we switch to something like pandemics, it drops way down, and we start thinking about, well, do we really have the money to afford it? Can we really make the investments? So that's part of the challenge that we're dealing with. And so our first panel for today is an extraordinary panel, and I'm going to very quickly turn it over to them. I'm going to do very quick introductions. This is about understanding and mitigating risks. And so the first panel, for those of you who've been with us, you've seen Mike Osterholm join us, so thank you again for coming back, Mike. He's the director of CIDRA at the University of Minnesota, and as I described him a couple of days ago, when the country faces challenges, he's one of the on the short list of experts we turn to, as he was after 2001. Dennis Carroll, next to him, is the director of the USAID Global Health Security and Development Unit, and has been deeply involved in these issues. USAID, when we talk about the importance of global health security, we often talk about CDC and NIH and the global health security agenda. USAID has been a very central part of this, and it's really been from Dennis's leadership. Hillary Carter, next to him, is the director for counter-biological threats at the National Security Council, has been working on global issues, not just global health issues, but global issues for quite a long time. Is a PhD from Georgetown. And then next to her is Mosoka Fala, whose official title is Deputy Director of General and Technical Services at the National Public Health Institute in Liberia. What he really is, he's been a close friend of the Institute for many years, is one of the people who was central to turning around the Ebola outbreak in Liberia. And he did it through a combination of both incredible intellect, but also personal integrity and trust, and working with the community quite directly, and has been a colleague, friend, and a hero of mine. So I was thrilled to have Mosoka join us. So why don't I turn it over to Mike? I think everybody's just going to make some reflections.
Good morning, and thank you again for the invitation to be here this week. It has been really, truly a remarkable experience over the course of the last 4 days, and I just want to thank the organizers for the vision to put this kind of a meeting on. Let me begin by saying that I, as usual, want to kind of send this meeting into a topsy-turvy moment. I would like to challenge the notion of what we talk about when we talk about pandemics and epidemics, and there's a very real reason why. It's not a semantic issue. It's an actual response issue in a key way. We often throw around the term pandemics and epidemics, and we intermix them, and I think that's at our own peril. To my mind, and I tried to discuss this in some length, the justification and the background for it in my book, Deadliest Enemies, Our War Against Killer Germs last year. I believe that there really are only two disease categories that rank in the category of pandemic. Remember, a pandemic is a worldwide epidemic, meaning every country, every region, every continent has the chance to have the same problem happen as does any other one. Obviously, first and foremost is influenza. Just to remind people, and Tony showed a nice slide up here, but our group went back and looked at this carefully, and by the time that the first isolate of H1N1 was identified in California in April of 2009, we now recognize that that virus was in at least 27 countries for certain, and maybe as many as 43 countries. It had moved that quickly around the world. That's a pandemic. The second category, I would say, is an unusual one in that it's not a disease in of itself. We are facing truly a pandemic of antimicrobial resistance, which is a pan-pandemic in the sense that on a worldwide basis, it's happening every day, everywhere. Some organisms may be more prominent in some areas of the world, but it's just a matter of time. Beyond that, all these diseases we're talking about are really what I call diseases of critical regional importance. Ebola is absolutely critical to sub-Saharan Africa. But will Ebola become a major disease problem in the Americas? No, not likely. Now, could we have cases, as we talked about, and I mentioned in my previous presentation the other day, that what kills us versus what hurts us versus what concerns us versus what scares us can all be very different. And we saw that with Ebola in the United States. But from an impact statement, that's very, very important to distinguish. Let me give you an example. We live today in a global economy that we are so dependent on others out there to supply to us what we need every day. As of this morning, pre-hospital drug shortages in this country, meaning what's on the emergency room cart, what's on the ambulance cart, right now we have 189 drugs that are either absolutely not available or in critical short supply. Many of them are absolutely life-saving drugs. Why is that? In part because almost all of them are generic, almost all are made in China, and the business model has been set up to cover the mode, cover the mean. Don't try to cover shortages, etc. It's too much money to have that much capacity. If you wanted today to go to war with China, and for anyone here in the room from China, I hope that never happens, they wouldn't need to fire one bullet to put their drug supply hands around our neck and strangle us. Our military is totally dependent on these same drug shortage drugs that we as the public are dependent on. When the situation happened with the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, everybody seemed so surprised that we had this big shortage of IV bags all of a sudden. I gave a talk 4 years ago in which I predicted the next F4, F5 hurricane to hit Puerto Rico was going to take down our ability to supply IV bags because 80% of the world's capacity to make them were all on that island. Should we have been surprised? The reason I bring this up is because from a pandemic standpoint, those diseases which impact those kinds of critical supplies will impact the rest of the world. And from a health standpoint, let me just say right now, for the 690,000 Americans that have chronic renal problems and are either on dialysis or drugs, which are almost virtually all coming from China, anything that shuts down certain parts of the world's ability to move product, make product, distribute product, is going to have collateral damage second to none. That's why we have to distinguish between pandemics and epidemics of critical regional importance. And so I think last night you heard me comment on the issue around vaccines. What we're talking about is a shortage of epidemic vaccines. Vaccines that are going to handle those diseases of critical regional importance with the exception of the issue of influenza. Now let me just say one last thing for some in the room sitting here saying, well, HIV and TB, aren't they all pandemics? Actually, by technical definition, they're not anymore. They were at one time, HIV in particular, but now it's endemic disease. Some cases it's hyperendemic, but it's not a new condition. Suddenly we're not going to see major social, political, and economic implications because of HIV that will disrupt that area of the world beyond what it's already doing. In some cases it's a horrible situation in parts of the world. TB is a horrible situation, but it's not going to change the political nature. So I think today as we talk about these, it is important to distinguish about what really causes a pandemic, a worldwide epidemic of a new disease versus those of critical regional importance, which can be very, very important, but they have totally different implications. We never worried about the impact on our US drug supply or the European drug supply with Ebola in West Africa. We worried about a lot of other things, but not that. But a pandemic that shut down global trade and travel would in fact be a very substantial problem. Thank you.